Okay, so this is the second video in the 5 video series. This video series on the blood. So what I want to talk about now is the formed element component of the blood. We talked about the plasma last time, and remember that if we were to take some whole blood and spin the whole blood down using a centrifuge, we'd get separation of the two basic components of the blood, and the lighter of the two is the plasma. Okay, and that plasma is going to be suspended on top of formed elements, which we see here in red. Okay, the plasma is going to make up the largest component of the whole blood, so about 55% of the blood volume, whole blood volume, is plasma, and about 45% is going to be formed elements. All right, so if we take a look at those formed elements, we have them laid out here next to the tube. About 99% of those formed elements are going to be erythrocytes or red blood cells. All right, so the major functions of the blood is to carry oxygen, and that's what the erythrocytes are going to do for us. The other components of the formed elements are going to be our leukocytes, or our white blood cells. Right, so we know that those are infection-fighting cells. And there are many different types of white blood cells. We're going to spend a little time talking about each of those, and each of these different leukocytes has an important function for the pathogen protection component of your body. And finally, we have platelets, and these platelets are the pieces of the blood that help us to clot the blood. If we take a look over here at how long these formed elements stick around in our blood, we've got some interesting variation. Well, first of all, where are these formed elements coming from? Okay, all the formed elements in our blood are produced in the red bone marrow. Okay, so I'm just going to put a bracket here, and all of these are going to be found being produced in the red bone marrow. Okay, and in the adult, there are specific locations in which we find red bone marrow. Okay, in the infant, red bone marrow is found everywhere. In every marrow cavity of the bone and every spongy bony space we find red bone marrow. But in the adult, we're going to find red bone marrow in specific locations. Okay, so the heads of the humerus and the heads of the femurs are going to contain large amounts of red bone marrow. And we're also going to find red bone marrow in kind of the axial part of the skeleton. Okay, and that is in the vertebrae and in the sternum. We're also going to find some red bone marrow in our skull bones as well. So very distinct, discrete locations. This might be the location where if someone did need a bone transplant, they could take bone marrow from a donor and try to match that bone marrow to the recipient's tissue type. Oh. Okay, so how long do these cells stick around? Well, red blood cells, they've got a very tough job to do. They've got to move all over the body, deliver oxygen to tissues. They're going to stick around for about 120 days, so between 90 and 120 days. After that time, the red blood cells are going to be sent to an organ called the spleen, which is found in the left upper quadrant of the abdominal cavity. The spleen is a very vascular structure. Okay, it's highly invested with blood vessels, and that's because the spleen is otherwise known as the red blood cell graveyard. Okay, and the spleen is going to kind of disassemble red blood cells after their time is up, and we're going to remove some of the components of the red blood vessel, reuse them, and other components will excrete. Leukocytes. So leukocytes are white blood cells. We can find them around living in our system, our cardiovascular system, for days and sometimes even years. Okay, so an infection that you got when you were a child, you may have produced white blood cells that you still have today, and those white blood cells are called memory cells, and we're going to talk about those when we get to the immune system. Other white blood cells only stick around for a few days, and then they're taken out of circulation. Finally, thrombocytes. So thrombocytes are otherwise known as platelets. So these are the ones that are going to be important in clotting the blood. Thrombocytes are going to stick around for a little over a week, and then we're going to get rid of those through the spleen as well. All right, so let's go ahead and move forward, and let's take a look at how these cells come about. Well, let's take a look at the cell line of our blood, and let's see where the white cells and the red cells and the platelets come from. They're all going to come from a parent stem cell, okay, called a hematopoietic stem cell, or a hemocytoblast. All right, so a hemocytoblast is going to be found in the bone marrow. Okay, specifically the red bone marrow. You have yellow bone marrow as well in most of your the shafts of your long bones, but that yellow marrow is strictly fat-based and can be used as a fuel source. But from this hemocytoblast, two cell lines will arise. One cell line is called the myeloid cell line, and the other is the lymphoid cell line. Okay, the lymphoid cell line is going to give rise solely to white blood cells. So this is our white blood cell line. Okay, the myeloid cell line is going to give rise to red blood cells, some white blood cells, and platelets. Okay, and if we look at this myeloid cell line, we can see erythrocytes. Here are red cells. Okay, and then we see lots of additional cells as well. So for example, we see a mast cell, or we see a basophil, neutrophil, eosinophil, and monocytes. These are all white blood cells. So I'm going to put a W here indicating that these are all white blood cells. Okay, and I'll put an R here indicating that that's our red cell. Also from the myeloid line, we're going to get thrombocytes. Okay, and I'm going to put a P here because those are our platelets. Right? If we look over on the lymphoid cell line, we can see these are all going to be white blood cells. All right? So as I mentioned earlier, all white blood cells. Specifically, the type of white blood cells, one of the types of white blood cells we're going to get from this line are really, really important infection-fighting blood cells called T cells and B cells. Okay, and these are the cells that are going to provide us long-term immunity. All right, we also produce another white blood cell from this line called the natural killer cell. And once we get to the immune system, we'll talk in specifics about what some of these cells do. We'll cover it briefly here in the blood as well. We're going to start out with talking about red blood cells, or erythrocytes. Okay, so just to remind you, erythrocytes means red blood cell. It's the same thing. Okay. So first of all, let's take a look at these cells. What do they look like? Well, they are biconcave. Okay, so biconcave, you can see the shape here in the top part of this image, and the biconcave structure is really important because it allows for very efficient oxygen delivery to tissues. All right, and the reason why that delivery is so efficient is because the cell membrane is very close to the cytoplasmic contents. So the cytoplasm of the red blood cell is here, and the cell membrane is very, very closely associated to the cytoplasm. So there's not a lot of distance between the two. And what that does is it allows for diffusion of oxygen out of the red blood cell and into tissues. Okay? And the oxygen moves out of a red blood cell by diffusion. So the closer we can get that tissue to the cytoplasm, the easier the oxygen molecule is going to be able to move out of the red blood cell. These cells are also anucleate. So anucleate means they do not have a nucleus. So this is one of the very, very rare instances in human biology where we're going to see cells that do not have a nucleus. So A means no nucleus. Okay, the job of the erythrocyte is so important in delivering oxygen that it actually ejects the nucleus kind of before it gets into circulation. So main function of the red blood cell we know is to transport oxygen. Okay, we can also transport a little carbon dioxide in the red blood cell as well. Okay, so you might not have have thought that that was possible, but in fact it is. But the main function is delivering oxygen, and the red blood cell is able to do so with a protein called hemoglobin. Okay, so hemoglobin is a protein, and about 98% of the intracellular volume or the intracellular contents of the red blood cell is this particular protein. Okay, so if we take a look at this histologic preparation of a muscle tissue slide, we can see here are red blood cells moving through vessels in the skeletal muscle in kind of single file lines. So they're really, really small cells, and they're being very efficient at their job, and that is to deliver oxygen to the working muscle cells. Okay, it's able to do that because it's got the biconcave structure, and it's packed with hemoglobin. Okay, so if we take a look at the hemoglobin molecule, what is the hemoglobin molecule made of? Well, it's a protein, and it is actually a quaternary structure. So if you remember from Bio 103, the proteins can be built in 4 different ways. There's a primary structure, a secondary structure, which is the alpha helices and beta pleated sheets. There's tertiary structures, which are these globular shaped proteins. And then finally, we have quaternary structures, which are 2 or more tertiary structures that come together to give us a new structure. Okay, and hemoglobin is made of 2 beta chains and 2 alpha chains. Okay, so we can see here is 2 alpha chains and 2 beta chains. These are polypeptides, okay, coming together, 4 polypeptides coming together to give us a larger molecule, okay, and that's the hemoglobin. At the core of each one of those polypeptides, we are going to have pigments that are red in color, and this is what gives your blood its red color. Okay, so just to reinforce this, all blood is red. Okay, blood is not blue. If you look at the veins in your arms, they look blue, and that's only because of the oxygen content of the red blood cells flowing through those veins, and also the way that that color is refracted through the tissues. Okay, so we're going to have 4 heme pigments. Each polypeptide chain, or each chain, is going to have a heme pigment at its core. Okay, and we can see the heme pigments. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 heme pigments, each associated with its own polypeptide chain. And we have associated with those heme pigments molecules of oxygen. So if we take a look at the heme pigment, here is a pigment of heme, and found at the core of that heme pigment is an atom of iron. Okay, and what's important about the atom of iron is this is where the molecule of oxygen is going to attach itself to the hemoglobin molecule. So if we have 4 heme molecules per molecule of hemoglobin, we have 4 molecules of oxygen. So each hemoglobin molecule can carry 4 molecules of oxygen. So 4 molecules of oxygen can be carried by 1 hemoglobin molecule. Okay, and that is because each hemoglobin molecule has 1, 2, 3, 4 heme pigments, and at the core of each one of those is a molecule of oxygen. All right, so let's go ahead and continue moving forward and talking about blood gases and hemoglobin. All right, so at the outset, on the first video, we talked about how blood flows through the cardiovascular system, and we know that blood that is leaving the right side of the heart, so I mentioned this on the outset, is going to the lungs. All right, why is blood going to the lungs? Why do we send blood to the lungs from the heart? Well, that's where we load oxygen onto the hemoglobin molecule. Okay, we put the oxygen that we inhale, we attach it to molecules of hemoglobin. So you can see in this image here, oxygen is moving into the cardiovascular system, okay, and it's attaching itself to the red blood cell. Well, what about carbon dioxide? What do we do with the carbon dioxide that's in our blood when that blood goes to the lungs? Well, that's where we unload carbon dioxide from the blood. So the lungs are going to, the blood in the lungs is going to load oxygen onto hemoglobin molecules, and carbon dioxide is going to be unloaded from hemoglobin molecules. And you can see that the carbon dioxide diffuses in the opposite direction, out of the blood and into the air sacs in the lungs, and we can exhale that carbon dioxide out into our atmosphere. Okay. Once that blood gets removed, the carbon dioxide gets removed from it, and the oxygen gets loaded onto the red blood cells. That blood moves back to the heart. Okay, you can see here, and eventually that blood goes into the left side of the heart. That blood then is pumped from the left side of the heart, and it goes into a series of arteries. Okay, that blood, remember, is high in oxygen and low in carbon dioxide, and the oxygen gets delivered to our working tissues, and it gets unloaded from the hemoglobin molecule at the tissue level. Okay, and we can see here that oxygen that was being carried on red blood cells is moving into the tissues. Okay, and carbon dioxide is going to move in the opposite direction. So working tissues, a byproduct of cellular respiration, the ability to make ATP, is carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide is going to be loaded onto the hemoglobin molecule at tissues as well. Okay. So we're going in the opposite direction here with both oxygen and carbon dioxide both times. Once the oxygen gets pulled off of the hemoglobin molecule and carbon dioxide enters the blood, some of it will be bound to the hemoglobin molecule. That blood is going to be delivered back to the heart. Okay, that blood's going to go to the right side of the heart, and that oxygen-poor blood is going to get pumped to the lungs to pick up more oxygen. Okay. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to talk a little bit about how we manufacture red blood cells. So this process is given the term erythropoiesis. So we know that this occurs in the red bone marrow. Red blood cells originate from a stem cell called a hemocytoblast. All right, and that hemocytoblast can differentiate or change into two different cells or cell lines, and the red blood cell is going to come from the myeloid stem cell line, and we're going to manufacture millions of red blood cells every second. Okay, so this tells us just about how many red blood cells we have in circulation if we're manufacturing this many per second. How do we make red blood cells? Well, the direction of the process by which we make erythrocytes, the direction is controlled by hormones. Okay, and it's also controlled by nutrient availability. So if we don't have the nutrients around that we need to be able to put the red blood cell together, that's going to significantly decrease the ability of us to make these cells. So what kind of things do we need? Well, we need glucose, of course. This is an ATP-driven process. We need proper amino acids, right? Because red blood cells, the hemoglobin component of red blood cells, is amino acid chains, those polypeptide, the alpha and beta polypeptides. The globin chains are amino acid in structure. We need iron, so we know that oxygen binds to the iron at the core of that heme pigment. So those are just some, important nutrients we might need. We need B vitamins, are important in the manufacturing of red blood cells. But hormones. So what hormone are we going to use in order to, or hormones are we going to use in order to manufacture red blood cells? Well, the most important is a hormone called erythropoietin, and it's abbreviated EPO. Okay, and erythropoietin is going to get secreted by the kidneys. So the kidneys act as little oxygen sensors. Okay, there are specific cells in the kidneys that can sense the amount of oxygen in the blood, and 25% of every one of your heartbeats, the volume of blood leaving your heart, 25% of that blood goes to your kidneys. Okay, so the kidneys can sense the oxygen content of the blood, and if that oxygen content in the blood is low, the kidneys can secrete this hormone called erythropoietin. Okay, and erythropoietin gets dumped into the bloodstream, and erythropoietin can go to the bone marrow, travels to the bone marrow, and stimulates those hemocytoblasts, those parent stem cells of all formed element cell lines, to differentiate or change into the myeloid cell line, and specifically differentiate into erythrocytes, so we can increase the erythrocyte content of the blood. And those erythrocytes are going to stick around for 90 to 120 days, delivering oxygen to tissues. Well, when we get done with those red blood cells, we need to take them out of circulation, and this occurs largely in the spleen. So the spleen is going to pull those red blood cells out of circulation, and what's going to happen to those red blood cells is they're going to be broken down. Okay, so the hemoglobin portion of the red blood cell is going to be broken down into its heme piece and its globin piece. And we know that the globin piece are for polypeptide chains. So we're going to dismantle those polypeptide chains into their amino acids, and those amino acids are going to go back into circulation, and we can use those amino acids for other things, to build other globin chains for the hemoglobin molecule. Maybe we use them to build muscle tissue. Well, what about the heme? Where does the heme go? Well, the iron atom from the heme is going to be removed, and it's going to be stored for a later day. The additional part of the heme is going to get excreted by the bile in the liver. The liver, one of the functions is to produce bile, so we're going to secrete the heme metabolic component in the bile. That's going to be metabolized by bacteria, and eventually it is going to be excreted in the feces. Alright, so I want to switch gears a little bit here and talk about some blood disorders. And the most common type of blood disorders are anemias. So what are anemias? An anemia is essentially a condition where we have the inability to keep the oxygen content of the blood stable or at homeostatic ranges. Okay, and what that can do is it can cause tissue hypoxia. So this term hypoxia is essentially a starvation by the tissue of oxygen. So oxygen is not being delivered to the tissue in high enough amounts, and the tissue is essentially starving of oxygen. Okay, what types of symptoms can we expect for someone who has anemia? Well, pallor. So what pallor is paleness. Okay, so our hemoglobin gives us our skin kind of a rosy color. Because we can see that hemoglobin underneath the skin in the blood cells, or in the blood rather. So we can expect somebody to have very light color. Fatigue. We need oxygen to make energy. So if we don't have enough oxygen around because of a particular anemia, we're not going to feel particularly energetic. And chills, right? So if you're not making a lot of energy, part of the byproduct of glucose metabolism or energy metabolism is heat. So if we're not producing excess heat because we don't have enough oxygen to make energy, well, it's going to make us cold. Okay. So I've outlined a couple of different types of anemias we can expect. The first one is hemorrhagic. So hemorrhagic anemia is anemia due to blood loss. Okay, so for example, if we get into an accident and we sever a large artery, we can bleed, right? And if we lose excess amounts of blood, so goes with it our red blood cells, and that can decrease the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood. And another example of a hemorrhagic type of an anemia might be if someone has an ulcer. Okay, so an ulcer is kind of a perforation or a hole that is formed in either the stomach or the intestine, and that that perforation or that hole can bleed, and we can lose blood that way internally. Okay, and that can cause the blood to be able to carry less oxygen. Nutritional anemia. So this is going to be the most common anemia. All right. So if we're just not getting the right nutrients, not getting the right vitamins and minerals and amino acid sources, we can develop an anemia. Okay. We can also develop an anemia if our absorption of those nutrients is poor. Okay. And this can occur especially in people who might have gastrointestinal problems. They might have inflammation of their intestines or sensitivities to certain foods that won't allow them to absorb foods very well because the gastrointestinal tract is inflamed. Someone who might not be able to absorb nutrients very well might be someone who is older in age, so our more geriatric type of population. As we age, we have a tendency to absorb things less well, and that can develop. We can develop an anemia that way. If we're not, as I mentioned, if we're not getting the proper nutrients, okay, so nutrient deficiency can contribute to anemias. And I think a lot of times the most common type of nutritional anemia that we know about is an iron deficiency anemia. Okay, so iron deficiency can be common in people who don't eat meat. So vegans, strict vegans, as long if they don't make sure that they're getting proper sources of iron from other means, other plants and things, they can have a deficiency of this nature. There's another type of nutritional anemia that can come into play, and that has to do with an anemia where we're not getting or absorbing proper amounts of vitamin B12. Okay, and in order to absorb vitamin B12, so B12 absorption, we need something called intrinsic factor. An intrinsic factor is produced by cells of the stomach. Okay, and if for some reason these cells of the stomach are not properly producing intrinsic factor, that all the vitamin B12 that we eat, it doesn't get properly absorbed, and we need vitamin B12 in order to properly manufacture red blood cells. So these are a couple of common nutrient deficiency anemias. Aplastic anemia is a reduced red blood cell production. So A means without. Okay, we might see a reduced red blood cell production, for example, if we have a cancer of blood cells. Okay, so leukemia, for example, is a cancer that essentially invades the white blood cells. And we know that white blood cells are produced in the red bone marrow, just like red blood cells. And if those cells become cancerous, they start to increase their number. And if we have lots of white blood cells, they can crowd out the ability of red blood cells to be produced. And if we don't produce enough red blood cells, then we can have an inability to properly carry oxygen in the blood. Hemolytic anemia. So heme refers to blood cell, and lytic is to split. Okay, so hemolytic anemia or red blood cell lysis. Okay, so red blood cells can break sometimes. Okay, and an example of when we might see hemolytic anemia is an example might be something called sickle cell disease. Okay, so sickle cell disease is a condition where the globin chains of the hemoglobin molecule are improperly constructed. So we know that a normal amino acid sequence is very important for the structure and the function of a protein. And in normal hemoglobin, there is an amino acid at position 6 called glutamic acid that is supposed to be between PRO is proline, which is number 5, and another glutamic acid, which is number 7. Well, in sickle cell, In sickle cell disease, one amino acid called valine is at the number 6 position instead of glutamic acid. And what that does is, under conditions where there's low oxygen in the environment, the person's red blood cells can form this sickle shape. Okay, so sickle is an instrument that can be used to reap wheat and grain, but you can see the very pointy edges of this red blood cell. And if this red blood cell is flowing through your blood vessels, you can imagine it would tear the walls of those vessels and get clogged in certain vascular spaces. So we want the red blood cell to be nice and round so it moves well through our vessels. People who commonly have sickle cell disease or they carry the trait for this disease come from areas of the world where malaria is spread through mosquitoes. Right? And why is that? Well, malaria is a parasite that feeds on the hemoglobin inside red blood cells. So the thought is that if someone is infected with malaria and these parasites start feeding on the hemoglobin in red blood cells, that's going to decrease the oxygen carrying content of the blood, right? And the thought is that if that person's red blood cells form this sickle shape and those hemoglobin molecules change their structure, that will help to reduce the ability of those malaria parasites carried by mosquitoes. It's going to help reduce the ability of those parasites to continue to grow inside the human. Okay, so the thought is if we can sickle those cells, that will help prevent the spread or the infestation of that particular parasite. All right, so this is going to conclude our red blood cell lecture, and we'll pick up next with white blood cells.